From Illinois, Mr. Lahood is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses here today for your testimony. I guess in looking at what the President and the administration are doing in Paris, you know, the word that comes to mind in some respects is almost illegitimate in terms of the pact or agreement that they're working on. And I guess my question to you, Mr. Grossman, in terms of circumventing the Congress and kind of doing an end run is what this looks to be. You know, whether we call it an agreement or a pact or whatever comes out of Paris, you know, is there going to be advice and consent from the Senate? Is there going to be ratification there? Is there going to be any input from the House or Senate? In looking at the elected Congress, what role will the elected Congress play in having input on something this significant?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. When you look at what the administration has discussed so far, they spoke in terms of a hybrid agreement where the central planks of the agreement, in other words, we're all assuming that there's going to be this agreement and countries are going to follow through on it in terms of financing and in terms of reaching emissions targets. But the way the administration has looked at it, due to the fact that they don't want to come to Congress, has been to have a hybrid agreement where those central planks actually aren't enforceable in any sense. They're pledges, they're promises, they're things that may or may not happen. But at the end of the day, you know, as a lawyer, I look at what does the law require you to do, whether that's international law or domestic law. And what's being contemplated at this point is an agreement that has no teeth, that doesn't commit anyone to anything. So in that instance, on the one hand, as a legal matter, that probably would not require advice and consent of the Senate. On the other hand, it doesn't really have any substance. But if the President were to go beyond that and to attempt to enter into binding commitments, I think that would raise some very serious constitutional questions and would really call into question the legitimacy of the United States' involvement in such an agreement.
And is there legal precedent for other things that have circumvented the Congress that have been upheld in federal court?
I think in this instance we're really going into new territory, because if you look, for example, at the Kyoto Protocol, both political branches recognized that the binding emission reductions that were part of that protocol, even though Bill Clinton had signed it, they recognized that Senate ratification was required, that it had to go through as a treaty. And because that never happened, because there wasn't the political support for it, the United States never ratified, it never deposited its documents of ratification, and it never took effect here. And so given that kind of precedent, I think the administration would be on very shaky legal ground were it to agree to any type of binding commitments.
Thank you. Mr. Cass, I want to follow up with you. You know, in looking at this agreement and looking at how we verify that foreign countries, India, China, Russia, are going to be compliant with the commitments in this agreement, you know, can you elaborate on that, you know, in terms of what satisfaction we can have that they are going to be compliant when they haven't had a very good track record of doing that?
Well, you know, I think one enormous challenge in that respect is that a lot of these countries don't really even have a mechanism for tracking, even if they wanted to be transparent. You know, there was an enormous story very recently when China admitted it was using about 17% more coal than it thought. It was an entire New Germany worth of emissions just within China. And the striking thing is that the Chinese said, well, of course, we're not going to change any of our commitments. Probably makes it easier to meet our commitments, but we're not going to change anything as a result. And so I think, you know, accurately tracking the pledges is an important challenge. The interesting thing with countries like China and India, though, is that they have not pledged to do anything except the trajectory that they were already on. And so in that respect, the question is less, how do we make sure they do what they promised, than why is no one standing up and saying they haven't promised anything?
Well, it's just a follow-up on that. You know, I was going to ask you, I was going to read, there was an agreement released by the White House regarding its 2014 U.S.-China joint announcement on climate change, and it said, quote, China intends to achieve the peaking of CO2 emissions around 2030. There is presumably a reason China committed to peak, quote, around 2030, and that word around is really undefined in this, and so we have no idea if this means 2031, 32, 35, or even later. And I guess in looking at that, I mean, doesn't this give an incentive to China to go beyond that in using that kind of undefined, ambiguous language? That concerns me.
Well, the reason that that is what China agreed to is because they had already done the work and knew that that is around when their emissions would peak anyway. Unfortunately, President Obama knew this as well. The U.S. government's own Lawrence Berkeley laboratory had done a very in-depth study 4 years earlier and had already said, based on the way China's economic development is going, it will peak its emissions around 2030. So for China to make that commitment now is essentially a promise to do nothing. And the fact that we are applauding that and putting our own very costly commitment up against it is really just another example of how poorly we are positioning our own country's interests on the international stage.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.